Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about the video game console redesigns. Sometimes the video game console just needs to be redesigned. Maybe it's not all that good. Maybe it doesn't look that good. Maybe it's not pretty. Maybe it's ugly. Maybe it has a few problems. So, video game redesign. Video game console redesigns. Let's begin now. It all starts back in the second generation of gaming when, in 1977, Atari released the Atari Video Computer System. This version had 6 switches, was brown, and pretty big. 1 year later, they made a lighter, smaller version. This sold for 2 years following its 1978 introduction. Now, the first notable change was in 1980 when they introduced a 4-switch version, replacing the 6 switches with only 4. Now you only got power, TV type, game select, and game reset. TV type was for if you wanted your game in black and white or if you wanted it in color, as many people still owned black and white TVs by this point in time. Now, two more years later, they introduced a black version which was nicknamed Darth Vader. Darth Vader was a very popular character at the time due to the Star Wars movies, The Empire Strikes Back, and of course the first one, A New Hope. So he was well within the public consciousness at the time for people to nickname his console Darth Vader, as this version, like I said, was black. 4 years down the line, in 1986, Atari released a smaller, sleeker, slimmer version, which greatly resembled the Atari 7800. This was much smaller, and under $50 at only $49.99, called the Atari 2600 Junior, or just the Atari Junior. This new rebrand as a budget console under their Fun is Back campaign allowed for them to sell all the way up until the early 1990s. And even following its discontinuation in the early 1990s, the console still sold for several years in certain parts of Europe, as many retailers still had lots of copies of the system to sell. As due to having very, very cheap games, you get many games for like a couple of bucks compared to the borderline $100 just one game for the NES. You can see why certain people still bought the Atari 2600. The next one we're going to talk about is the NES. The NES released the Nintendo Entertainment System, simply called the NES oftentimes, was released in North America in 1985. It was square-shaped and gray. This was the same for many, many years until 1993, when they remade it. Instead of being put in like a video cartridge like this, you now top-loaded it like this. This was because of the spring-loaded mechanisms that they needed to put in the cartridge in, sometimes causing reliability issues and problems. Now, coming with top-loaded, you didn't have that problem anymore. Rumors say it was also because people used to put their drinks on top of the machine, they would fall over, wet the machine, and it'd break. But this new, smaller redesign could not hold any drink at all. Alongside that, they introduced the dog bone-shaped controllers, with rounded edges. Many people were complaining that the sharp edges of the original controller hurt their thumbs after a time, but these rounded edges of the dog bone-shaped controller prevented that. Next, what we're going to talk about is the Sega Genesis. Sega Genesis Model 1, the first version of the console was released in 1989. It was much wider and rectangular shaped. This was the same way until 1993, when it got a redesign as much smaller, and more square-shaped. Now, even smaller version, even more square-shaped version, came out in 1997. Though its size were a little bit more like this, it was still very square-shaped, and it was even smaller. And it could not support any of the add-ons, as the add-ons included base power converter, which allows you to play the Sega Master System games, their previous console, the 32X, which allowed you to play 32-bit games, the Sega CD, which allowed you to play the CD games, and the Game Genie, which allowed you to hack and mess with your video games. All supported on the Model 1 and Model 2, not supported on the Model 3, released in 1997. Now, the last game for this episode is the PlayStation. The PlayStation, first released in North America, in Japan in 1994, and following year, 1995, after its Japan 1994 release, was released in North America in 1995. It was originally rectangular shaped in gray, and came with analog sticks, analog controllers, which were the D-pads found on things like the NES, on the NES or Sega Genesis. Now, this was sold up until 1997 when they discontinued it, as in 1997, as in November of 1997, they introduced the DualShock controller. Now, there had also been the dual analog controller. The dual analog controller used game pads, which is what you use nowadays for game consoles, where you use your thumbs, and it included the D-pad, so it was a mix of both. But both the original analog D-pads and the dual analog, the game pads with your thumbs, and D-pads are both discontinued following the introduction of the DualShock controller, which is the one they still use to this very day. Now, the game console would actually get redesigned in the year 2000, as it was now white instead of gray, and it had much more rounded edges instead of these sharp corners of the original one. It's much more rounded and circular-like, and it came packaged in with the DualShock controllers, while the original version came packed in with the analog controllers, and the DualShock and the dual analogs were peripherals that you could buy afterwards. So you couldn't get them with the console. You after you bought the console, you go to the store and buy them. But now, the DualShock was sold with it, and it was also renamed to the PS1, as it was remade to look like this following the release of the PlayStation 2. And this was a version that was sold for several years up until the final discontinuation of the PlayStation 1 several years later. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got to say about game console redesigns. Sometimes they're necessary, sometimes they're not necessary. Sometimes they're a good business decision, so you can rebrand your console as a cheaper budget gaming console, which is legitimately a pretty good idea. But I gotta go now. So, bye. Have a nice time.